My name is Chris Smith. I'm a Romany gypsy. I've lived in Herefordshire for the majority of my life, although I have moved around. I've spent some time in Australia, lived in London for a while. So yeah,
Okay, but can you tell us a little bit about the origin of Romany gypsies?
well, the origin is we originally originated, I believe, Romany gypsies, and I think it's probably worthwhile me explaining the difference between Romany gypsies and Irish travellers. So Romany gypsies, we come from a predominantly Asian culture, so the genetics in my blood probably go back to the foothills of the Himalayas. And at some time in the 14th or 15th century, we moved out of India and travelled across the continent, picking up words as we went along, which makes up our current language, because we speak something in this country that's known as the broken language or the Pogadi Jib. So yeah, that's the the history of Romany gypsies is that they left India probably in the 14th century, moved across the continent, and moved into loads of different areas.
Okay. Can you tell me a little bit about your family and their connection to hops?
Yeah, absolutely. My mum was Elizabeth Smith. She died at the age of 89. She was one of 15 children. And she basically grew up around the sort of Hereford and Wales borders, travelling all around Herefordshire, backwards and forwards down to Evesham for whatever work really was going at the time. So that would usually some kind of picking work, whether it was they would probably be going to Evesham for plum picking in the summer, for example. But at the beginning of the summer, you would always have things like strawberries, black currants. So that would be working around the Herefordshire area.
Okay, and what about their connection to the hop picking?
Well, by the time I came along, my mum and dad had actually settled onto a hop farm. So they were living at we were living at Yarkhill Farms, and I think we were pretty much settled there for over 20 years, I think. So I grew up basically playing in hop yards, alongside my mum who was working in those hop yards.
Okay, can you describe the work? And the work
Absolutely. Well, you would start off with stringing. That would be the start of the season. So, and it was a really hard job. My brother used to do that, and my dad used to do that. I only ever did that for 1 year. But it was incredibly hard. It was basically a long, thin pole made out of wood with string going through the middle, and you would have to hook that string onto a hook that was about that far out of the ground. And then you would be hooking that onto wires that were going over the hop yard. So you'd have posts going down, wires over the top, and that the stringer would basically put the string in, do the stringing, and you'd end up with a V shape. And then usually women like my mum and other people would come along and do what they call bracing, and that was simply tying those two bits of string together to make them taut. And then the hops, basically when they were about so high, you would have hop tires then coming in, and then again that would usually be Romany gypsies. But this was in the sort of mid-60s to mid-70s, and this was at a time when travellers were actually welcomed into communities. They were welcomed onto farms because they were doing that work, and they worked alongside settled people very successfully. There were mainly the type of people doing that type of work would have been housewives, generally. So you had travellers working alongside ordinary settled people, and I don't recall ever there being any problems around that or any racism. In fact, it was a very different time. I don't really recall growing up experiencing racism in a direct way. I think there was racism, certainly, but it was more hidden, and people were more wary about what they could say. Whereas you look at what people can say today, and it's really very worrying. If you look at a headline, for example, about travellers in a newspaper, and you look at that online and you look at the comments section underneath, the comments are truly awful. You know, that it's inciting hate crime, and that's very worrying. So there's a big shift there, and that shift was because rather than being having a community who was valued for the work and the skills that they bring, now we're just seen as a problem. You know, as in, where can we move these people onto so that they're not living next door to us? So we've gone from that being valued to being non-valued. Well, it was very important because there weren't any other people who were going to go into those fields and do that work. You know, we were the workforce, and that's why we were so valued. Because we brought those skills, we had those skills, and we were able to turn up, do the work, stay. And what would generally happen is people would turn up a few weeks before the work started, they would get settled, the farmer would make sure that they were settled in some nice field somewhere, and that they had somewhere to stop and somewhere to pull their caravans onto. And then the work would start, and generally then that work may last several months. But it wasn't the case, you know, as soon as the work was done, farmers said, oh no, you have to leave. People would often stay on for several weeks, sometimes months after, until the work was ready in another area of the country, and then they would move there.
Describe the importance of the Gypsy Romany community in the workforce.
Well, as a Romany Gypsy, it was incredibly important. Do you want me to do that again?
It's just a bit of overlap on that. Sorry guys, I'm really sorry. Maybe a bit media, but sorry. You just got to be careful of the...
Yeah. And because Chris knows what you're going to have to do, just say when you're ready.
Okay.
Okay. Well, as a Romany Gypsy, it was very important. You know, my parents relied upon working on the farms to get a living, as well as doing other things. You know, some travellers were involved in scrap production or things like that, but my family weren't really. We tended to rely upon the farm and the farmers for our living, as well as, you know, doing other things like going out and selling Lucky Charms or what we used to call Durkin. You know, my mum would tell fortunes. So it was actually a brilliant way to grow up. You know, it was a very healthy lifestyle. You grew up on a farm, you had lots of other people and lots of other travellers around at certain times of the year. So it wasn't like it is today. You know, you look around today and you see kids who are doing nothing but playing on their iPad or their iPhones all day and barely looking up from their phones, whereas we were out predominantly outdoors playing or working. And I actually, you know, worked alongside my mum and dad from a certain age in school holidays, for example, or something like that. We would absolutely go out and do work.
Yeah, but how important were the Romany Gypsy community
Well,
to the actual hop farming?
Oh, without the Romany Gypsy community, that hop farming wouldn't have happened because we were the workforce predominantly. You know, there were settled people who did some of that work, but predominantly it was Romany Gypsies who were moving around and doing that work. You know, my brother was actually one of the best hop dryers in the country. He won major awards. So his skills were very valued.
With the introduction of mechanisation into the hop fields, how did that affect the Romany Gypsy community?
At the beginning, not very much, because the first mechanisation was probably hop picking machines. Because prior to hop picking machines, it would all have been picked by hand. So my parents, as they were growing up, and they would have been picking by hand into cribs. And cribs were made out of material, basically, and strung between pieces of wood, and you would just pick into that crib. So the first mechanisation was probably hop picking machines. And this meant that you could actually pick the hops quicker, is what it actually meant. But again, it was mainly Romany Gypsies that were working on the hop picking machines, along with some settled people, usually housewives, who wanted extra money for the family. So, but again, I don't remember any. There were no real issues at that time. I don't remember any overt racism, for example. It just wasn't around as much as it is now. But mechanisation, basically, as it grew and grew and grew, you know, now they've got machines that will do pretty much all of the work that 10 people did in Hopfield. So, yeah, it had a massive effect. It meant that What it really meant, I suppose, was we went from a position of being Romany gypsies, went from a position of being valued for the skills and the workforce that they bring to not really having any of that value because they were no longer required. And that meant that there was a shift in public perception. So we went from a position of Romany gypsies being valued in society to a situation where it was more NIMBYism. Oh, we don't want you in my backyard.
Okay. Well, was there ever instance of Romany gypsies or travellers being segregated on the hop farms?
Not that I recall, and certainly not on the farm that I lived on. There was no segregation of that kind that I can remember then, no. And certainly, and although you would see certain pubs, for example, would have in hop picking time no Romanies allowed or no travellers allowed, again that was few and far between because those travellers brought wealth into the community. They spent money in those pubs. The overt racism was simply not as bad as it is now. There is far more overt racism these days, and that is led from the top down. Well, there have been several acts that have affected the community, the most recent one being the 2014 Act, actually, that was brought in. And this was brought in via planning. And what it basically says is, we will only consider you to be a traveller if you travel. And this is a bit like saying to a Jewish person, you can only be Jewish if you live in the state of Israel. Do you understand? So it's a very divisive act. And it's certainly something that has caused travellers a lot of problems. And I don't think that government can pick and choose about ethnicity. Somebody either is, their ethnicity is Romany gypsy or Irish traveller, or it isn't. You can't say, oh, for this reason it isn't, or for that reason it isn't. The truth is, if you're a Romany gypsy, you're a Romany gypsy. And no amount of government legislation is going to change that. What we're seeing here is non-recognition of that ethnicity by government. And that is very important because what it's basically saying is we will pick and choose. They're saying we will pick and choose when we consider you to be a Romany gypsy. And that's simply not the case. Loads of Romany gypsies, I've heard it said that, you can only be a Romany gypsy if you travel. Well, again, this is plainly ridiculous. 60% of the population now live in houses. People don't lose their ethnicity because they move into a house. They take that ethnicity with them. And it's very important that that is recognised, that it is a recognised and protected ethnicity. And most people don't even realise that. And most people don't even realise that there is a difference between Romany gypsies and Irish travellers. The Irish travellers their ethnicity is they're indigenous to Ireland. Theirs is a Western culture, whereas Romany gypsies, ours is an Asian culture. We came predominantly from India. So there are major differences there. But the issues affecting both groups are basically the same. The prejudice that both groups face is absolutely the same.
When and how did the role basically change from being valued to not?
Okay, I would say for Romany gypsies, it would probably be around the mid-80s when the big change came. And that was probably because mechanisation was taking over in a big way at that point, and that meant that farmers needed a fewer workforce. And so there was a change then in culture, because rather than travellers being valued for the skills that they were bringing, all those values disappeared, because farmers no longer needed those skills. Those skills then weren't as valued by the community, settled community, and it meant that gypsies and travellers became basically pushed to one side, partly because of mechanisation and partly because of cheap labour coming in from abroad. So it meant that gypsies and travellers were basically sidelined from the workforce. and that was a major shift in the perception, really, of how travellers were viewed by the settled community. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is in the days before health and safety became a huge issue. You know, and how it would generally work is you'd have, my dad would probably, because my mum and dad would work together in those days, so my dad would be doing the bine cutting. So you'd have bines coming down to the floor. My dad would have a hook. He would go ahead in front of the tractor and trailer, chopping those bines off at about sort of waist height. And then you would have the tractor moving down the row very slowly. On the back of the tractor, you'd have a trailer. On the back of the trailer, you would have what's known as a man in the crow's nest, and that was, I can remember, I've got pictures of my uncle doing this. So you would have this metal, I can't describe it really. It was it's almost like a metal ladder with a cage around it, and this would hook onto the back of the trailer, and the person would have to climb up inside it and stand at the top with a hook and then chop the bines off from the top. And it was incredibly hard work. And my mum was, you would then have two people in the trailer actually laying the bines. So they would be just placing those bines as they came down so that you get the maximum amount of bines really in a trailer at one time. And then you'd have somebody walking behind the trailer picking up what was called picking up flags, which was picking up sprays of hops that had just flown off when they were being chopped from the top. So, because nothing was wasted, everything went into that trailer. So my mum was doing that job one day, and she was walking along quite happily picking up sprays. And the guy in the top, his name was Clive, and he's a lovely guy. And he hit this bine, and it was really tough, and he hit it in the wrong way. And the hook came out of his hand, flew out of his hand, and went flying through the air. And it was just a miracle that it was the handle that hit my mum on the head and knocked her out, because had it been the blade, it would have probably taken her head off. Okay, well, on this particular day, my mum was doing the job of what they used to call picking up flags or picking up sprays, and this is walking behind the trailer, making sure that no hops are missed. And the person in the crow's nest, his name was Clive, who was a lovely guy. He hit a bine a bit awkwardly as he was trying to chop it, and the hook flew out of his hand. And it flew through the air, and it was just a miracle that it was the handle that hit my mum on the head and knocked her out, because had it been the blade, it would have probably taken her head off, you know. And I was actually working on the hop picking machine on that day, and I remember somebody coming up on the tractor and saying, "Your mum's okay, don't worry, but she's been knocked out." I was like, right, okay, how did it happen, blah, 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 you know, but yeah.
Can you tell me about your uncle? You worked at Custom Farm?
My uncle Aldi, yes. His real name is Aldred, but we always called him Aldi. And he worked at Claston Farm for 30 odd years, and was very well known there. And did everything basically. He was employed by Philip Davis. So, and I remember when he got ill, we were living out at Withington at that time, and I remember I think it was Philip Davis who came down to see him, and make sure that he was okay. And because he was actually a really valued worker, he'd worked on that farm for a very long time and had a great many skills. Okay, yeah, my Uncle Aldi, and Aldi was short for Aldred. It's not a name you hear these days, is it really? But he worked for Peter Davis at Claston Farms for 30 years and was extremely valued, I think, by the family. It's so much so that when he actually got ill, it was Peter Davis who came down to see him on a few occasions to make sure that he was okay. And that tells you really the difference, in some of the difference in the times. I don't think that would have happened had it been today. But in those days, farmers tended to look after their employees.
You were talking before, like, the way they used to live, and then the roll top. And had
Yeah, my mum and dad, they would originally have had roll top caravans. And then they moved to what was called, well, they were called barrel top. wagons, and then they would have moved to a square top, because square tops had a little bit more room, were a bit more intricate, and had a bit more kudos about them. And traveller wealth is all tied up with what you own, rather than how much money you actually possess. It's more about what you own and what those things are worth if you wanted to sell them. And this is why the settled community sometimes look at travellers and think of travellers as flash, and they think, they see a traveller with a nice caravan and nice new, for example, nice new, do you want to do that again? Originally, back in the day, probably 40s, 50s, 1940s and 1950s, my mum and dad would have been travelling around in barrel-top wagons. They would have probably moved from a barrel-top wagon to a square-top wagon simply because it had more kudos, it had a little bit more room. It's amazing actually to think how many people sometimes lived in one of these caravans. You'd have mother and father, maybe 5 or 6 children, and you look inside and you think, well, where did everybody sleep? But not everybody slept inside. Some people would have slept underneath the caravan, for example. Other people may have been sleeping in tents next to the caravan. So it wasn't always the case that you had sort of 8 or 10 children jammed inside cupboards inside a caravan. Actually, it was a bit more spread out than that. But yeah, they would have had all of those types of caravans, barrel top caravans and square top. And they would have also had, I've heard my mum and dad talking about their open lot, which is basically a cart which you put everything else on, and that would be pulled by a horse, and that would be going along with you as well. So a lot of families would have had not only a caravan but an open lot as well. We used to call the Mordiford housewives the Mordifords because they came from Mordiford. But these were mainly settled women, housewives who wanted a bit of extra money. And so that they would come out and they would work alongside the travellers on the fields, doing the same work as the travellers. And I don't remember, there was no segregation. There was no, travellers worked in this field, settled people worked in this field. Everybody worked together and everybody got on together. And I can remember my mum, sitting there with a lot of these Mordiford women, just having a laugh as she would with anyone else. I don't remember any overt prejudice or racism from those people at all. We were just an accepted part of the workforce.
We've looked at a lot of old photographs. Probably might be before your era, but there's a lot of lots of. I'm just interested in the kind of outside work stuff. So the kind of the evenings and the weekends and the sitting around the fire and those kind of things. A bit of a picture about that.
Yeah, do you know what? That was one of my favourite memories. Is we used to have an old metal thing that we used to put a fire in, and I'm pretty sure we used to call it a devil, and I'm pretty sure that's what it used to be called. So you would have, after the hot picking day had ended and people had had their food and their tea, people would gather around the fire, and I loved it because people would tell ghost stories. And I, as a child, sitting there, and I can remember sitting there listening to these ghost stories and being too frightened to walk back to my own trailer.
Excellent.
Okay, it's worth remembering that Romany gypsies and Irish travellers, in fact all travellers, have gone from a position of being valued within communities for the skills and the work that they used to bring. And that, we've gone from that to being non-valued. We're not valued by these communities anymore. And we're certainly not valued by government. And racism and prejudice is led from the top down. And, when government brings in legislation, as it did in 2014, that basically says you can only be a traveller if you travel, this is absolutely ridiculous. It is like saying you can only be Jewish if you live in the state of Israel. It's the equivalent of that.
I think it's important for these stories to be recorded.
I think it's important for these stories to be recorded because in traveller history, we generally don't have a written history. What we have is an oral history. So unless these stories are recorded in this way, a lot of the time they're going to be lost as people, inevitably get older and die. So yeah, it's very important that these are recorded. This is I call this the Walton shot, because this is my mum and my dad and my sister and nieces and nephews and some cousins from down in Wales. But you can see this is where we used to live. We actually lived on the village green pretty much, and you can see the houses in the background. And the farmer valued our skills and our workforce so much that he actually put in toilets and showers and wash basins for us. You know, it was all on hand for us really, and that tells you at that time how valued travellers were to the community. This is one of my favourite pictures. This is me when I was about 3 years old, certainly before school. And this is my mum telling me where to look at the camera. And you can see this is the hop yard, and I'm actually with her working in the hop yard. This is a nice shot because this is one of those shots that shows you what happened after the hop picking was finished, or after the work day was finished. And you can see you've got the kettle prop here with the kettle over the fire, and people just stood around waiting to get their drink. So it's a lovely picture, very evocative. And then here, you've got, these are the people that mainly worked on the machine, what we used to call the hop picking machine. So you've got my uncle, my auntie, several cousins, some Joni Lee, and I think that's Mr. and Mrs. Boswell there. And this is my mum and my sister. I mean, you can see my mum's got a cigarette in her mouth there as she's working. But that, you can see how backbreaking that work was, because you were basically in that position all day, you know, and it was incredibly hard work.